Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again today by Josh Blank, research director for the Texas Politics Project. Good late morning, Josh.
Good morning to you.
Good post-election morning.
Yeah. That feels good.
I mean,
I
it's
like a
not,
good post.
As elections go, it's not.
It's low key. It's like a warm-up election. It's preseason for the real elections.
Right.
Is how
not
I feel.
That, every election matters. Don't get me wrong.
That's why everybody votes in every what? Never mind.
So, right, exactly. So, two big political stories in Texas today with, no, lack of spin-off things to consider. First, to be as local as possible, as I mentioned, the off-year elections, which in Texas mean constitutional amendment elections and some notable local races, took place yesterday. We're recording the morning of November 8th, so the morning after, literally. There were also some big elections in several states across the country that people are looking at as, potential leading indicators, which leads to our usual point about overinterpretation. We'll just get that out now. For 2024. Nonetheless, some interesting results out there, I think. And then second, just like that, the legislature will soldier on through a fourth special session called by Governor Abbott on the heels of the expiration of the third. And well, I think that's been, very discussed. We'll come back to that as well. But let's start with elections. On the constitutional amendment election, what can you say? The odds are pretty good for these amendments. If we add what the, thus far unofficial results are to the historical data that you can get from the venerable Texas Legislative Reference Library, the Texas Legislature has now proposed, counting this year, a total of 714 amendments. Of these, 530 have been adopted and 181 have been defeated by Texas voters. And there are 3 amendments floating out there that never made it onto the ballot. And I did not go back and dig out what the story with that is for another, historical footnote podcast.
I think the 4 special sessions in a regular session year, sort of historical fact is enough for everybody this week.
Yeah, right. So this batch of amendments did better than the, basically 71% batting average historically. And, Josh and I were talking offline about going back and figuring out what the historical trend looks like here. And we have a kind of outdated graphic on our website in our educational section that we'll try to get to updating sometime in the, I won't say near future, but in the foreseeable future. So voters have unofficially, again, at this recording, passed all of the 14 proposed amendments, with the exception of Proposition 13, which would have raised the mandatory age of retirement for state justices and judges to 79 years old. And that went down by about the margin that everything, the average margin that everything outpassed, maybe even a little below, but in that 63% voted against that. Biggest winners were Proposition 4, validating some people's view of the world, I think. Authorized, which was the big property tax cut amendment, which was hard fought during this session. And Proposition 9, which provided a cost of living adjustment to teacher retirement pay, the first one in quite a while. Each of those received 83% of the vote. 2 closest votes, besides the loser, Prop 13, Proposition 10, which was providing tax breaks for medical manufacturers, and Proposition 12, which abolished the Galveston County Treasurer's Office. Those were the closest winners with respectively 55 and 53% of the vote. So overall, not a lot of surprises here. I mean, I think the thing to speculate here is what happened with Prop 13. And I You and I think we haven't even really talked about it. I tweeted something about it last night in a very hot take, but I think it's a hard time to talk about age.
Yeah, I mean, I think
in politics.
Well, and I think that's the point, though. Exactly, right? Which is when you say that, you're raising this issue that's floating around right now about the age of the two leading, candidates for the Democratic and Republican nomination for president, and this sort of ongoing discussion. Not only, I would even say about that, I'd even throw in sort of, issues Mitch McConnell has had, over the last few months, and there's this broader discussion about, again, sort of the geriatric nature of most of our leaders in this country.
I think if you did a Google trend search for gerontocracy, you'd see a big spike.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Google word, I could imagine the Webster word of the year being something
along
with that,
those lines.
Something along those lines. But I think, the point there is actually, there's a sort of a subtle point in that, which is, it's easy to say, oh, well, yeah, people are thinking about that. But I think the major point here also is to say, I don't think this is the sort of thing that people came in with significant opinions about, right? So, I mean, as the history suggests, you don't put, legislators don't put amendments on the ballot for them to fail for the most part. They're put up because they generally think that voters are going to support them. When it comes to the age limit increases, there are all kinds of discussions you could have about that are actually kind of complicated. In fact, someone called me to sort of talk about this, and it turns out it's actually kind of complicated when you start to go into and think about, is it good to have term limits? Well, sure, but in Texas, a lot of our justices are elected. So do people feel like that creates some sort of, transparency, some sort of, avenue for voters to weigh in on this? On the other hand, there's just this broader sense that, politicians are these sort of, they're sitting in these offices forever, and they should. I think honestly, the latter probably had more of an impact on people's views. This idea of just sort of, politicians, judges, elected officials sitting in office, sitting in positions into advanced stage when they shouldn't be there. Those are valid concerns. Do I think that, again, that voters really were weighing out the different sort of, competing normative arguments here or the policy arguments such as they existed? I kind of doubt it. And so therefore, when you say, is this like a coin flip? No, I mean, in general, we shouldn't let just older people make these decisions.
Yeah. And I mean, I agree with that. And I think we should note that for something that, as you say, was not getting a lot of direct policy attention, was discussed in, committee in the legislature, et cetera, et cetera. It is going to have,
real effects.
A real effect, and almost immediately, in that, the Texas Supreme Court Justice Nathan Hecht will be 75 next year. So he will be affected by this.
Right. He doesn't have to retire immediately, I believe. I think there's a little bit of a kind of grace period if you go over, again, when you're elected and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, no, I mean, there is sort of just a politics to this. As I sit back, and I mean, I didn't see the debate on this and sort of what led to it. But I mean, it seems to me there are a number of Republican justices who will now in the next few years go up for re-election in, we're going to be, I'm going to say necessarily challenging electoral environments, but I would say uncertain electoral environments considering what we've seen in the last number of years when it comes to sort of, down ballot judicial races in Texas.
Yeah. And I haven't really looked at how many judges are affected by this, but that will happen soon enough, I suspect. So,
right.
Other things were going on in this election as well. And the other thing, I think the next thing that really got as much, if not more attention, really, at least inside the community, the professional political world, was the mayoral race in Houston, where Mayor Sylvester Turner is term limited, is about to finish his second term. And, there were there were some very familiar figures to the Texas political world in this race, and that the top two candidates were State Senator John Whitmire and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee.
Right. They obviously advanced to the runoff. Not really surprising there. I mean, I think, polling before this race had portended that it was likely that these two would make it to the runoff. I mean, you could say maybe there's a surprise and one of them would have gotten over 50%, but nobody really expected that. They're only separated by about a little over 17,000 votes. And the next, highest sort of running, candidate got 7.2% of the votes. So, ultimately, this is kind of what we expected. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Obviously, there's been a lot of, as is usually the case in these races, a lot of stuff happened kind of near the end.
Right.
Particular, the release of an audio recording of Representative Jackson Lee using some expletives in I'm not going to say a rant because I don't like to. I can't value. I'll just say
I would almost describe it as artful.
A heated discussion. Anyway, I'm sure Senator Whitmire.
I have the artful use of vulgarity to my mind is not.
Well,
I'm not saying I'm not advocating it should weigh in one way or the other in terms of being the mayor of Houston, but.
Well, city politics are a curious thing. So, it is what it is. And the fact is, Whitmire began this race with, I think, certain, I would say both strategic and just resource advantages, that he was able to apply to this race. And I don't think that, this ordering of the initial results, not surprising. Now it's going to be a question about, again, mobilizing, different constituencies within the city and seeing who's more effective at that.
Right.
What's going to be a low turnoff run out.
And it's going to, we got it's a month away. So there's a lot of time for a lot more negative ads and a lot more, surreptitious recordings and the like.
Yeah, I think we should expect that. We'll see.
And then also in Houston as a deep cut for the text-less crowd. Paxton attorney and media figure Tony Busby made it to the runoff for a Houston City Council seat against incumbent Mary Nan Huffman. So that runoff, that race will also be in the runoff.
I thought you were going to say CBD infused energy drink entrepreneur.
Well, the thing is that the man admits of many adjectives.
Yeah, no, Renaissance.
There you go. Nice.
Okay.
I like the way you accented that a little like Zach Galifianakis in The Hangover.
It's funny. Well, it's if you're going to say it, I like to say it with an accent like
with a
that.
Little Zach Galifianakis flair.
I think it fits here.
And then another race, watched by the Text Ledge crowd, but also not a big surprise, was the HD2 seat rendered vacant by the exit of former House Rep Brian Slayton. Amidst pretty nasty scandal during the session. And, that's been, this has been a Republican race that has, brought out Republican factionalism. There'll be a runoff there too. Number one finisher was Brent Money, who is the Defend Texas Liberty candidate, if we can say that, basically the candidate of the far right insurgent faction of the Republican Party. Second place was Jill Dutton, also a Republican, 25% of the vote. You can read all about this. From, their endorsements through their campaign consultants, through their financiers. This is one of those very clear, far right versus the right in the Republican Party, with a kind of, money being the candidate probably most likely, shall we say, to carry on the ideological traditions of Brian Slayton and how he would behave in that seat.
Whatever that means. But yeah.
Right.
But I think one thing I just want to like throw out here, and you already mentioned this, but like, you know, the results that we saw in this race yesterday, and I think also the results of the runoff, you know, there's going to be a lot of desire to overinterpret these results. Now, some of this is going to be purely based on self-interest. So whoever wins is going to say, you know, whether it's Money or Dutton, the various aligned groups of them are going to say, this shows, you know, what Texas voters think. And it's just important to step back and say, number one, you know, these candidates received about 11,000 votes total.
Yeah.
One, in a district that is overwhelmingly conservative that originally elected Brian Slayton. So let's, you know, put it into context. So to say that, you know, these results speak for the broader Republican Party or anything, or about, you know, where they come down on the Paxton trial, anything is just rank horrid overinterpretation of the results.
Yeah, I mean, this is a, you know, a very, you know, kind of exurban/rural district, more rural than exurban, but there's some elements of that in it. It's, you know, 74, almost 75, you know, it's just over 74% white per the last redistricting estimate. You know, I imagine it's gotten even a little whiter since then. So if anything, as you say, this is, rather than being a leading indicator of how the tides are shifting or not shifting, you know, it's a lot more an example of gerrymandering and the drawing of safe seats for incumbent Republicans.
Yeah,
and for incumbents writ large, to be fair.
Well, and I would say the only thing that we can watch it is it's a road test of what, you know, what themes, you know, again, it's a road testing of themes right now for both of those types of candidates and how we might expect candidates in similar positions going into the full primaries to sort of interact in this new dynamic, which puts sort of, Defend Texas Liberty PAC, et cetera, Paxton, et cetera, that group on one side, and sort of, let's say, the speaker and, whomever else you want to include in that on the other, broadly.
So let's, I think let's look a little bit at some of these national results, and not because, we're going to break any news here or, these, if you followed this, you probably already about had it up to here with hearing about all this, particularly if you were watching live election results last night. This is always the case on election night, but especially on these off-year elections, there's a lot of air set aside for, not a lot of things to talk about. So, other than, refreshing your memory of, what counties vote which way in states like Ohio and Virginia and Kentucky. But so let's talk about those. So, I think, the big national news here is in Ohio, where in terms of, the desire to overinterpret is, going to be very powerful here, but it's also a bigger data point, I think, to be fair.
Sure. Yeah.
The constitutional amendment there passed guaranteeing abortion access, and it passed fairly easily despite, Ohio's relatively newfound status as a pretty Republican state. I mean, 10 years ago, we used to talk about Ohio as a swing state. Right. Not really that way anymore. Or is it? But I think on this, the proposition passed 57-43. Opponents of abortion are quick to point out that a lot of money poured in on both sides, but by most reports I've seen, a lot more money and a lot more resources on the pro-abortion or pro-choice side. Well, I'm going to put a pin in that. Let's just run through the states. The other interesting vote there, in terms of, some of the most popular data we ever have in our archive, is that Ohio also voted to legalize recreational marijuana.
Yeah. Right. And actually, this has been, a strategy, in quotes, I would say, of some groups, but notably ground game Texas.
I had a strategy, but I can't remember what it was now.
Well, I mean,
I'm sorry. That's just that's too obvious, but I can't help it.
But, ground game Texas has sort of made, a place for themselves sort of in the conversation here, at least basically putting, essentially either decrim or legalization ballots on, basically, or measures on the ballot where possible, is really an effort to increase Democratic turnout and, of course, achieve progressive strategy victories or whatever they say. But, it's interesting, again, in a state like Ohio, which we now, again, was definitely a battleground state. Now we think of as basically a Republican state, but still you look at these two issues and I mean, it does sort of give more, I think for a group like that's trying to raise money and sort of move in that way, it really puts more credence on the approach.
Yeah, I need to go back and, look a little more closely at the Ohio data, but, I wonder if people aren't, pulling the trigger a little too soon on that, particularly given some of the candidates that have won in Ohio. There may be a little more competition around the fat part of the distribution than people are giving Ohioans credit for. The other big, one of the other big states, or they'll just do these quick, two quick big states here. In Virginia, Democrats win majorities in both chambers of the state assembly. One they had, the other they flipped. Another state race, and this often happens with Virginia because they have these off-year elections. We saw it. We've talked a lot. We have occasion to reference Glenn Youngkin on this podcast more than one might think. And, Youngkin, this was seen as a big political, high political stakes for Youngkin, seeking to solidify his position in Virginia and his position as a national political figure, in part because of his success in 2021, mobilizing voters and putting together an issue agenda that seemed to, tap into what we'll very roughly call here MAGA sentiment without going full MAGA. And now I sound like Hakeem Jeffries or something, but I don't mean to that. But I think it's a clear way of expressing this, that, Youngkin was seen as a reliable kind of, in some ways, he comes across like, the last generation's conservative Republican, but that's why he gave a lot of hope, I think, to that faction and that sentiment among Republican elites and Republican opinion leaders. And there have been discussions of him, jumping in at the very last minute. Now that's become, more and, even
Trickier.
before this election, that was becoming, I think, less and less likely. And, the kind of thing that why wouldn't Youngkin encourage that discussion, even as he said he still had business to do in Virginia. But the business he still had to do in Virginia, it seems to have not worked out in this election very well. So I think the general kind of, hot take after this is that this is going to slow down his mo in the short run and, leaves him with some work to do before the next presidential election cycle, let alone the next gubernatorial election now in Virginia.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a big part of, again, tying back to Ohio, one of the big sort of pieces of this campaign was that Youngkin had proposed a 15-week abortion ban, basically. And I think a lot of GOP leaders had hoped that this would provide a test case and maybe a better path forward on abortion politics than they've seen based on, again, these continuing election results. And so I think, whether fair or not in terms of interpretation, a lot of people are sort of looking at Youngkin's failure to, maintain at least, some dominance over the political system there as a slapback on this 15-week ban, which if that were to be the case, that would kind of put Republicans back at kind of, in some ways, ground zero and trying to figure out how to move forward in a way that's electorally palatable on these abortion issues.
Yeah, and I think if you look at this and you look at Ohio, I mean, it provides some, degree of confirmation for the argument that we made on here, and that's very common out there, but is certainly evident in our data in Texas and is evident in a lot of national data, which is that the dog catches car aspect of the victory in the long battle by conservative activists to overturn Roe has created big problems in terms of public opinion, and even where the central voter in the Republican Party is, let alone, elites in the Republican Party.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think if you're sitting here looking at this from 30,000 feet, I mean, I would actually say that, the best thing for Republicans is like what happened in Ohio, because actually what it does is it takes the issue away from you having to deal with it. It means that it's not going to be an issue in the general elections, in the midterm elections and the presidential election, at least as far as Ohio is concerned in terms of its local politics. And if anything, it puts, I think, Republicans and conservatives back in a safer space, which is to say, we need to overturn this injustice. Well, that's what they had been doing, and that's what they had been using to mobilize voters. And it just actually kind of sets that back, kind of into position, I think, in a place like that.
Although, to set the theme that we'll come back to, I think, is after we talk about what's going on in our legislature, Republicans are having a hard time settling at a strategically sound point, no matter no matter what, no matter how big the signs are with the big arrow going, you need to go this way. And, I think they're having a little trouble with that in a few areas. So just to kind of round out a couple, one or the other, in Kentucky, another reason Democrats are, sort of feeling good this morning, incumbent governor and, again, maybe rising star, Andy Beshear won easily over a Trump-endorsed Republican, the AG, Daniel Cameron. In an otherwise, I'll say it's Kentucky.
Yeah.
I'll say it's a deeply red state, but seems kind of ridiculous, And again, you're seeing, as with the Youngkin, and maybe the Youngkin is a good lesson here, you're seeing a lot of Democrats, even going into this race, very quick to say, Beshear, maybe, here's a model for, how to make it in red states, or how Democrats can position themselves in rural and traditionally conservative areas. We'll see.
Yeah.
And lest Dems be too happy, and, their other kind of, which was much more of a fantasy, and Beshear was polling well going into this race. So, but, the Democrats did not manage to take the governorship of Mississippi, which was a much longer shot. But they wound up not winning that one. So it's not all,
wasn't wild. It didn't get wild last night.
So, I want to move on to the legislature, but I think there is we've kind of talked about abortion.
Yeah.
Seemingly a winner for Democrats, when you can put it at the center of the agenda, seemingly still a loser for Republicans if it is. I think there's still a lot of, as you were saying, a lot of caveats about that. I think this is still pretty context dependent, but, I think you have to look at last night and think there's a little more grist for that general argument.
Yeah, I think the Virginia result is interesting, on that in particular. Ohio to a lesser extent. What's interesting about both those states is they're both, reasonably competitive states. And it's something interesting just talking about Ohio. It's like, it used to be I mean, we talk about Texas a lot, and we say, Texas is quote unquote a red or purple state. And I always have to remind people, like, well, if even if the Democrats like win a race or something, it's not like Texas turns blue tomorrow and now it's blue and now we're in this blue state. And that's the same thing with Ohio. I mean, that 57-43 split is like, this is a state that's become nominally Republican pretty consistently so, but it's still, relatively competitive in the scope of things. And I think, you can kind of see that there. I mean, the flip side of this is just sort of, I think a lot of people were talking about this going into the election, but, it seems like Democrats are in a position, and this is some combination of, I think party dynamics that people are discussing a lot right now, and party, sort of where the Democratic Party is and is not attractive in the electorate, but also the issue environment and this specific election. You're talking about an odd numbered year. You're talking about the ability to really bring abortion politics to the center of the discussion, even in a place like Virginia, where that wasn't necessarily actually about abortion, but it was a big part of the campaign. I think it's a big part of the campaign in Kentucky in a lot of ways in terms of what people were voting on, even if it was closely attached to a particular candidate.
Yeah.
And in that low turnout race on this particular set of issues, I think it makes Democrats look strong. But then the sort of subtext of this is a bunch of polls coming out that kind of show that Biden in particular looks really weak in a lot of these, a lot of important states in the general election coming up, and sort of other polling data that indicates, declining Democratic, sort of identification among sort of key constituencies, Black and Hispanic voters, in a way that, the question becomes, it used to be you'd say, well, in these low turnout elections, Republicans have this clear advantage, these off-year elections, these weird special elections. Now it looks almost like the opposite. Democrats have the advantage there, but as the electorate gets bigger and bigger, that advantage looks like it probably shrinks a bit. And this at least is going to, again, does this prove that story? No, because we have to go to the next elections and see. Yeah. But it reinforces this discussion that's going on right now, I think.
A lot of discussion in the last few weeks, given, there was a cluster of 1 year out national polls that just fed that discussion like crazy. None more than the New York Times Siena poll that had Biden losing in 5 of the 6 swing states or something like this, in a Biden-Trump matchup. Terrible numbers for Biden. But, I think, so now you have another, and I think another sort of addition to that discussion. Yeah. And you're seeing that just raging in all of the press statements and the morning newsletters and the post hoc analysis of this election. And I think it was Politico boiled it down to this, and it's a little, oversimplified, but there's kind of a, how much is this good news and how much is this bad news? And what's the mixture for the Democrats? Right. And in particular for Biden, following on what has been, a terrible week for Biden in terms of just, media discussion. And, the good news spin is, that, the Democratic brand doesn't seem to be as bad off as people thought. And that, in fact, if the diagnoses out there of growing weakness for Democrats is off, then maybe this helps Biden. But the bad news spin is, Democrats seem strong based on this. And again, even that is an overinterpretation. But if you're going to run with that, but Biden is weak, and that in fact, this underlines the degree to which Biden is weak compared to other Democrats and to Democratic baselines. I'm not entirely persuaded by either one of those, but it's interesting that those are the frames that have emerged.
Well, it's easy to imagine, given the last few weeks of the news coverage and the data and the election results, that if the Democrats had a deeper bench right now, which is one of the big sort of factors in all of this, is the fact that there aren't, you can't list on two hands, let alone really even one, let's say a solid set of Democratic challengers to Biden, just say, right? But if there were, you could imagine in a week like this of these elections, some of them coming out saying, look, we win on the issues. We win on these key issues. And the truth is that we're being pulled down by Biden. And the fact is you need someone else. And the problem is there's nobody else who cuts a profile enough to make that argument convincingly at this point.
Right.
So I think that's where I think, the Democratic teeth gnashing is gonna continue right now. In some ways, it'd be one thing if Biden was doing terrible and they were losing all these elections. Then you'd go back and say, well, what do we need to change? But the way that things have shaken out, it's sort of like, well, the thing that they need to, that they're talking about changing is the guy at the top, and and obviously, but that's sort of a non-starter at this point.
Well, particularly given that I think, they're
not going to force him out.
I mean, they would have to drag Biden out of there physically, I think, make him, not do this. So yeah, I mean, I think that kind of sets a lot of this up in terms of the intermingling. You look, the electoral races were not so telling here, but the other big story here, the return of the legislature, does kind of underline the undermingling of kind of national and state and local Republican politics in the state of the party. So, as I said, starting off, legislature will be soldiering on, and the fourth special session is underway as we speak. Everybody gavelled in on Tuesday, and things are underway. Now, I think the Senate is moving a little bit slowly. We've had news that Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has been, at least as of over the weekend, had been sidelined with with an illness. So we haven't really seen him, I don't think, much recently. Remains to be seen how serious that is or how it will affect proceedings in the Senate. House committees are meeting this week to consider two of the key pieces of legislation that the clock ran out on and triggered more conflict among Republicans in the last session. So they're meeting on HB 1, which is the Chairman Buckley's kind of kitchen sink education bill that has money for vouchers and other funds sprinkled throughout for public ed, as, the long anticipated realization of let's put some cards on the table and see what kind of deal can be made.
Yeah,
there'll be 2 days of
pages.
Yeah, there'll be 2 days of hearings this week. Right now, they're scheduled for Thursday and Friday, and I think notably, public testimony is welcome, which I think one could take as a sign of a commitment to good government, but also one could take as a sign that nobody's in a hurry to ram this thing through at this point.
Yeah.
And then, and then the State Affairs Committee will have has a Thursday meeting scheduled on another very controversial bill, HB 4, which is the controversial enforcement bill, and to bring these threads together that on the front side of this looked like it would be part of a great unifying effort by the governor and the leadership to use border security and immigration to lower the temperature among Republicans, even if it did lead to big fights with Democrats. Instead, in the third session, the passage of two competing bills on this front triggered, a massive slap fight between the lieutenant governor and the speaker, that really underlines just, for the umpteenth time, but, I don't know, I guess we shouldn't continue to be surprised by this, but the tenor of the last week of the session was, as we said last week, completely off the hook in terms of the exchanges between the governor and the Speaker of the House.
I mean, they were just bizarre. I mean, I don't. It's sort of like, it goes beyond even. You've got basically one side accusing the other of a huge Texas-sized catch and release bill, which is sort of the denigrating way they talk about the U.S. immigration system. The other one, describing, I think Patrick describing the House bill as is like a pro-illegal immigration bill. It's the sort of thing that honestly is kind of just crazy. And it's sort of crazy to me because, just broad context, take a step back. No matter what, this is going to be challenged in court immediately. Whatever the details of this bill turn out to be, this is going straight to court. And also this movement straight to court is
versions.
Not whatever. That's the thing. It doesn't make a difference which version. And also just to say, that's also not lost on the bill authors. This is, part of an ongoing strategy to place Texas as sort of, standing, at the border, fighting both, undocumented immigrants crossing, but also the federal government's in action on the other side. This becomes another case in the exhibit. So they don't mind going to court over this and having a long, drawn out battle over, whether or not the federal government really has sovereignty or whether they're doing their job over on immigration, blah, 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 blah. But the whole point is that the details of the bill almost make no difference to this fight because it's going to be challenged immediately, which is why it's so bizarre to think that, again, outside of other things going on, which we'll get to when we kind of discuss this a little deeper or soon, it's sort of like you guys couldn't just come up with something here. You couldn't just...
Yeah, it seems like, this is a real inability to stick to the script here.
Yeah.
I'm sure people say, well, there's no script. That's, and I don't mean that in a conspiratorial way, but, the political benefits to Republican candidates at this stage of the game seem pretty clear. Now, I don't want to come off as naive. There's the argument that, in the absence of a voucher bill, the lieutenant governor and the leadership of the Senate are not going to be satisfied with anything and are not going to go along with the script that says, okay, we'll save face, pass some border security bills, unconstitutional, constitutional, whatever. We'll take those to our primary voters. We'll, funnel more money to the governor's office for yet more border security enforcement and, live to fight another day. Or as the governor said in the beginning, or we'll fight it out over vouchers in the primaries. Well, I think that's not what the lieutenant governor wants to do at this point. So again, I don't want to disconnect these two things too much saying, but
I don't think you can disconnect.
But I still think it's kind of gobsmacking that it's gotten to this point.
Well, it is because, and again, here's the thing. I mean, I think to your point, right? You could imagine a world in which they pass, the border security bills and then Abbott calls them back for vouchers. It's also very easy to imagine a world in which they would have passed the border security bills and Abbott would have said, look, I'm not calling you guys back to not be able to pass anything. We're done. Thank you. Goodbye. And I think it's very easy to imagine. The fact is it's not, Patrick has held up legislation in the past to force a special session. It's not beyond him to do that. I'm not saying that's what happened here, but because I don't know. But at the same time, when you look at, again, the rhetoric going back and forth about, what ultimately, should be something that they should be able to agree on relatively easily here. I don't think, that the policy disagreement is, I think that point is what, really makes you figure this is not about the specifics of the border security bill. This is about the chess match between, the three-dimensional chess match between the House, the Senate, the governor, to see who can box who in. And, I think Lieutenant Governor Patrick is not ready to get boxed in by the border security play. Yeah. And that's what we're seeing. So I guess, that kind of moves us, to step back a second. I mean, that does move us on to, where we think the negotiations are on, the school choice public ed bill. Near as I can tell, and again, I've talked to a few of the principals and watched this, and we've looked at we've done a ton of polling. It doesn't seem like they're there. Well, well, here's the thing. I mean, there's something that I was thinking about this morning because I knew we were going to talk about this. And, I'm very I think the policy process is a negotiating process, and especially when it's as public as this and when, we're so focused on just a few issues, right? So I don't think that necessarily the policy that's getting released by either chamber or even by the governor's press releases are reflective of what any members of any group think the final legislation is going to look like. It's merely a starting point. But nonetheless, you sort of watch this and you say, okay, the Senate goes, again, in the third special session now, basically runs through the voucher bill, says we're going to basically give, about $8,000 a student or whatever. Then the House comes back and says, well, we would consider about $6 and change to attach it to some other stuff. And then and then the House says, then the governor says, actually, no, I've negotiated something with the speaker, which again appears to have not actually been true in any
substantive sense.
Substantive, thank you.
There might have been a misunderstanding.
Yeah. They certainly may have discussed it. But then they come back and he's saying, oh, we're going to be giving, these, 10,000, 10. And then the House comes back with Buckley and they could be like, how about 10,000? How about 10.5? And so as you're just kind of watching this go on, not to mention all the other monies and all the other funds being talked about, you just sort of go, is this real? Are they really? And so part of this, and this is sort of the questions that I think come along. We get to this point now, and I'm just laying out sort of the up and down nature of what has looked like negotiating kind of up to this point. But I think the question becomes, even with Buckley's bill, with what's happened up until this point, however you want to look at it with respect to, whether or not, they're going to move forward on the border security stuff and how, have the fundamentals really changed? You know what I mean? Have they changed significantly in terms of what the negotiating pieces are? Significantly enough for the House to move a bill, for Patrick to accept it, and for Abbott to sign it.
Right.
And as of right now, it sort of seems like an open question. And there's
so far we haven't been able to get the conference.
No, that's the thing.
answering any of those questions.
Well, the issue here that's interesting to me is, there's all this sort of focus on the ideological opposition to vouchers, but the ongoing concerns within the Republican conference have nothing to do with like church-state separation or anything like that. They're worried about program costs. There's a big debate over the Legislative Budget Board authority to move funds outside of the legislative process into this program or not. And that was a big stick. It's a very technical matter, but a pretty big sticking point between the House and Senate versions. There's big questions about eligibility, who actually gets to use the program, the price tag, both individual dollars to students and families, but also collectively, whether there's a cap. There's this whole issue about transparency, tracking, and whether or not the students have to take an assessment. And there are big disagreements, even among, again, the coalitional players. These are not like ideological concerns per se. Yeah. These are just like policy concerns that have not been, really.
And going back a little bit to our angels dancing on the head of a pin, conception of some of these things. And all of those things are simply inside of a freestanding voucher bill. Which the implicit admission here seems to be, no matter what's in there, that's not passing. Right? So there's all those things internal to the bill to argue. And then there's this broader picture where people say, okay, well, how about if can we move it by putting all these other things, which then magnifies all those kinds of problems in terms of cost, administration, distributive questions, all of that in that even broader. And I think it does raise the question of kind of, I think you're right. And, we talked about this, I think, when the third session started. The differential desire of people to make any kind of deal, or the effort of the different sides to induce the other to feel like, okay, well, now I'm ready to make a deal. And really, whether it's, either the very strong pro-voucher side, the very strong anti-voucher side, or even those who would be open to, well, if you could meet my price, then maybe I'll, but I just don't see that there's a settlement in any of those areas thus far for a lot of the reasons that you're talking about. And, so I think if you step back just to kind of, get us to the end here, you look at these kinds of fights that are going on over something that maybe people don't, a lot of people don't want.
Right.
In terms of vouchers. Some people do want them pretty badly, and we talked the polling on that to death and talked about the elite pieces. But that, in legislative terms, the votes are just, do not seem like they are there.
Right.
And, in terms of what's changed and what hasn't, look, I think it's fair for proponents to say, look, we have moved the ball forward. The third session wasn't a complete waste. We've now got a bill in the House that has a bunch of stuff in it.
Yeah.
That has the trade-off grand bargain elements, even if it's, as you say, it's not a done deal. And we're starting the session with the governor giving us a call that has everything in the call, unlike the beginning of the third. So, to be fair, there has been some movement. That doesn't mean it's enough. That does argue that, what people are going to try to see here is some continuity on that. But there's still too much disagreement. I would say step back. You look at that, and then you look at where we are on this immigration stuff, which, as we've said, is just kind of bananas. Mm-hmm. I think so consistent with what we've been talking about all this session is that once you get within a certain limited range of discussion within the de facto control of the agenda by the Republican Party with, some input by Democrats, but not a veto input.
Right.
The kind of fights that everybody attributes to ideology, they give way to other things. They give way to political ambition. They give way to these, I don't see how you look at that fight between, all those exchanges that we're making so much of between the lieutenant governor and the speaker last week without going, there's just a thing here that has nothing to do with politics per se,
Yeah, well, no, it has nothing to do with ideology. It has something to do with politics. I thought, one of the things just stuck out to me at the end of last week is, look, again, on the border stuff, you can't tell me that you couldn't pick 5 random Republican senators from the Senate and let's just say 10 random Republican members from the House, and they couldn't come up with a border security enforcement bill that would pass.
Right.
Just no chance in my mind that would not happen. And it's also, you can't say, well, the Senate didn't have time to pass the House's bill because, it's like, no, the Senate could have passed anything it wanted as fast as it wanted. We've seen them operate that way when they want to. But instead, you've got this sort of, you replace that instead with this acrimony. And the thing that really stuck out to me, and I'll just highlight it again, was Patrick basically saying the House needs to just pass the Senate's bill. And it just strikes me as so remarkably crazy in some ways that a politician as accomplished as the lieutenant governor would continually reinforce a dynamic that makes the House less likely to support what is ultimately his agenda. I mean, it's one thing to talk to, basically to know that you just need, 21 Republican senators to do whatever you want, whenever you want. And the truth is that works pretty well. And if anything, what it probably also does, it also probably limits policy debate, because if a bill moving through the process, and especially in a session like in these sorts of scenarios, is the favored vehicle of the lieutenant governor, not only, is it going to take a lot for you to say no, like this isn't a good bill, but also I think it probably limits the amount of criticism that these bills take. And I mean, and again, someone who watches this stuff fairly closely, I'm not saying that either chamber is better or worse or whatever, but the House seems to have a lot more, I would say, friendly fire. You have a lot more, both to the ideological diversity, among other things, Republicans asking questions of Republican legislators about bills that I just think you see less of in the Senate. But then when the lieutenant governor basically says, no, the House should just pass our bill and move on. This is the House that hired Dade Phelan, Bonin, and Strauss, who all had ongoing running conflicts with the lieutenant governor over basically similar power dynamics. Ultimately, you have to kind of take a step back and say, who's the problem here?
Well, I mean, I think, if the lieutenant governor if we were fortunate enough to have a lieutenant governor here, I think what he would say was, well, look, the House did that to us in the first special session. That was essentially what Dade Phelan told us. So there's a little of this to go around for everybody. Now, that said, I mean, I think this is, one of the reasons we're constantly going on about, understanding the institutional axes of conflict and how the nature of the two institutions feeds the conflict under these circumstances.
Yeah.
Right. No, because, Dade Phelan, Dade Phelan has a completely different set of, political conditions to meet than does the lieutenant governor. And that's not going to change.
Well, and I think I think this is an important thing to note. I think about the lieutenant governor in particular and on these issues, right? Which is, the lieutenant governor is nearing the end of his political career, right? I mean, he's probably going to run again. He originally had indicated that he wasn't going to run again, then he says he is, but he's not going to run in perpetuity. He's coming near the end of, his run in government. And I think there is something, sometimes that I look through this kind of stuff and I think, if there is something that he has a preference for, it's for quicker action, bigger action now. I mean, if you think about the debate, where they started on property taxes, Patrick wanted, again, big homestead exemption, let's return dollars into people's accounts immediately. The House was focused on compression, which would lower the rate at which property taxes were increasing, which would have a long-term impact, but it's not really going to give voters a difference in their pocketbooks right now. I mean, the voucher thing, it's not enough to set up a pilot program and to incrementally build it up, which is like how most programs work. It needs to be a big program. It needs to be right now. And I mean, I think, and even when you look at some of the debate on the border security bill, I mean, one of the things that I think the House, had, I think, a reasonable concern with was, in the Senate version, essentially the state was going to be, housing some number of these migrants that it caught. And ultimately, this is, in a public safety or criminal justice or whatever budget this comes out of, DPS budget, that's already stretched pretty thin when it comes to this. And this becomes an ongoing liability. I mean, that's something I think the House is aware of, that you have to pay for in perpetuity. Now, again, if you're going to plan on sticking around for a while, but if you're not...
Well, and, I don't want to give the House too much or too little credit.
No, I don't either.
But I would say, but I mean, to buttress that point, I mean, our polling has shown pretty clearly that incarceration piece is where you run into trouble, right? Because you get, because it's a hard thing to do. I mean, it's part and parcel of the issue that if you're going to start detaining people, that detention becomes, creates numerous issues, whether it's cost, conditions, family separation. I mean, there are just tons of vulnerable points in that. Now, I will say that and this is, I think, probably my view of the legislation generally, but, the House version solution to that of empowering law enforcement to cart people off and take them back to the border and essentially repatriate them to Mexico, whether they're from Mexico or not, is equally problematic, if not more so, from a policy perspective.
Well, and again, the broader context here is none of this is going to...
Right, which brings us back to where we, what our earlier point that, if you're going to, and so, the fact that the House and the Senate are disagreeing over these two equally untenable positions underlines the gestural politics of this, right? Which is that, again, broken record time, to the extent that, border security and immigration are the issues for Republicans and they're a winner, but and they're a clear winner with their voters for the most part. It's just back to where we started. The fact that that's going to be the point of argument, and that would be why they wouldn't pass the bill or work something out is kind of mind-boggling. But it's only mind-boggling if you set aside the strategic considerations that we talked about earlier, which is that, one can say, the flip side of the argument that the governor gave us the opportunity to pass these immigration and border security bills, which is a political gift to every Republican for the most part, could be seen as, from one perspective as well, why wouldn't you guys just do that? And then you can or can't do a voucher bill. Then we all knew that was going to be hard. But, as we've said, I just think the lieutenant governor is not ready to concede that. And the question is, and it's the question that everybody is asking, probably including the lieutenant, will he ever?
Right.
And so when we get to 3 weeks from now, if it lasts that long, and who knows what they're going to do about Thanksgiving, presumably they're going to take a Thanksgiving break, but or they're going to get everything done quickly before Thanksgiving. I don't expect that to happen.
Yeah. I mean, there's no indication.
Right. So now, again, I'm wrong all the time.
Yeah, sure.
So, but it certainly doesn't look like that. And so,
real compromise emerges pretty quickly when it emerges.
Yeah, it always feels sudden, even if, at this point, its development will have taken quite a long time. But I think we once again, see this, interesting intertwining of, the national struggles and the national questions within the Republican Party right now, as everybody looks at Trump's dominance in the presidential race, in the presidential nomination race, and wonders, whether and if anybody's going to be able to fight that in a very competitive environment. But now that we look at what's going on here, you do see a different version of the same story, and that this factional conflict is just so, intertwined, to use that word again, with all of these other axes of conflict, and at the local level that are clearly kind of determinative so far.
Yeah.
Right. And whether people are gonna get around and see the incentives, to find some, to agree on some kind of compromise, both within these legislative areas and in the bigger picture of what they're actually going to do.
Yeah.
I find it hard to believe that they're going to finish a fourth special session and not produce another border security bill.
Well, and I think and look, what it comes down to is that, and I think our polling really backs this, is that, unlike in past sessions or on past issues, the lieutenant governor can't say, we're not passing a border security bill until a voucher bill gets passed, because it doesn't have the support among voters or in the conference. And so that's why, instead of saying that out loud, it becomes, well, this is an amnesty bill, or,
or you're soft on immigration.
You're soft. Oh, the Democrats are ruining this for everybody. And the Democrats are looking around like, well, okay.
Yeah, or, democratically controlled Dave Phelan or something.
Right. Some nonsense. But I mean, again, he can't say that. He can't say this is the exchange point, because it just doesn't add up politically.
It's his bargaining position, but it can't be his public bargaining position is what it certainly looks like at this point. So,
right.
On that, Josh, thanks for being here. Fun chat. Thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Didn't reference a lot of polling data today, but you should look at our blog site and our data archives, our polling results at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. If you're interested in the podcast, there's lots more to interest you there. Thank you for listening this week, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.